morning, even though it's afternoon now. My name is Dominique Bachelet. I'm an associate professor in biology and ecological engineering at OSU, and I've been a climate change scientist since 1989. In the last decade or so, I've focused my energy not only on creating content, but also designing a variety of communication tools to share climate change information. This year, it's my great pleasure to announce that the Corvallis Arts Center has generously chosen to host an art show this fall dedicated to climate change under the title, What Will Nature Do? The public media have been effective at inflating the importance of climate deniers and at focusing on the worst negative aspects of the projected changes. The writing of these journalists has been found to cause denial, numbing, apathy, and more importantly, despair and hopelessness among the young. Today, we know that climate change is here, and we have seen the youth of the world rising and demanding action to limit the negative impacts on their generations. There are many ways to envision the future, and as a modeler, I've spent quite a bit of time simulating transitions towards a world adapted to warmer conditions. Given the inertia that has followed the thousands of publications, reports, and congressional hearings, I find it essential to diversify our approach to envision the future if we want to reach a broader audience. My optimistic view is that climate change was caused by us humans, though we can do something about it. Many colleagues have talked about solutions and identified low-hanging fruit to get there. I'm hoping that through this series of lectures by scientists who are experts in their field, artists are inspired to give us their vision of what might happen when we get people engaged in working together in the spirit of responsibility and solidarity to fix the most egregious problem we've created. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of our science speakers. I've asked them all to show us how ecosystems do function to survive adversity through adaptation and evolution. Erica is director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute and a professor at the College of Earth's Ocean Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. She received her BS and MS from Stanford University and a PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno. She has more than 25 years of experience conducting research on ecological responses to environmental change and the management of natural resources on public and private lands in the Western US. Although Erica is a desert mouse at heart, she has discovered the magic of Gore-Tex socks and is becoming quite fond of large mossy trees. But I can tell you, I don't think she's seen the biggest ones yet. I'm hoping someday we'll take her to the Valley of the Giants somewhere on the Coast Range, and that should be a good trip. Anyway, Today is the Ides of March, and so Erica, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Dominique. And thank you for helping me to start learning about some of these trees and places. I moved to Oregon last April, and so it's been all pandemic all the time, and it's been I look forward to having that end. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. It's exciting to me that Dominique and all of you have put together this series on art and climate change and hopefulness. And even though I honestly like spending a lot of time in places that don't have very many people, I like people and like thinking about how nature and people can do some innovative and productive things together. So I really liked this. We think a lot about how animals and plants adapt to changes in climate, and sometimes animals and plants wish that they could be in charge. So I want to talk about adaptation today, and I'm thinking about a couple different types of adaptation in an ecological sense, and there's a little bit of jargon, so you can remember this or not, but so a couple of different types of adaptation that ecologists think about. We think about something called phenotypic plasticity, which basically means that, that physical appearance and behavior can shift. And we all see examples of this in our daily lives as humans. We see this in our yards. We see this in our pets. It's fairly common. There's also adaptive evolution, which is sort of natural selection, kind of the traditional sense of evolution. And plasticity, the extent to which there's that sort of flexibility in appearance and behavior, that's heritable, and it also can evolve. So when I talk about adaptation, I'm thinking about all of these things in the ecological sense. So I think different talks have gone over this, and I'm going to streak through major changes in climate that organisms are responding to. And these slides say Oregon, but it's broadly applicable across the Western United States. So temperature is increasing. It's going to continue to increase. It's increasing in all seasons, but up here, especially in summer, we're getting more days that are hot, and it's hotter on those days. If you say, what's the threshold for hot? Doesn't matter. Whatever your threshold is, we're going to have more days that reach that and more days that exceed that. And something that is pretty interesting, when I say interesting, I don't mean good. I mean, I find it intellectually interesting. Especially with respect to public health, is that in a relative sense, nights are becoming warmer than days. And that has a lot of consequences for passive cooling of structures and for how people cool off at night. I lived in Davis, California for 6 years full time, and I could leave my office at, I don't know, 6 o'clock or something like that on an August evening, and it would be, well over 100 degrees out. It's a little bit like a blast furnace, but then, you get home, you open up windows on either side of your house and you get a nice cooling breeze. So some challenges there in the future. Precipitation in this part of the world is staying consistent or is increasing slightly, but some pretty big changes in seasonality that we're already seeing. So summer's becoming drier, winter's becoming wetter. And one of the important things is that we're getting more rain and less snow as it becomes warmer. And so all of this in part, and there are some other things that contribute to drought. So something that often people find interesting is that drought, although it certainly is related to precipitation, you can have increases in precipitation and increases in drought at the same time, because a lot of other factors are contributing to drought, including that increase in temperature and more rain as opposed to snow. But mostly I'm not going to be talking about that. That's kind of the preface. So there are a lot, as Dominique said, a lot of language in the media, and sometimes with some advocacy groups is very much a gloom and doom narrative about climate change. And there are things that are horrendous, and especially horrendous for people. But I am somewhat, I guess I'm cautiously optimistic about nature, if only magically people could get the heck out of the way. So there's an overlay of land use change that is really serious. But I'm going to be talking about some things that that nature can do when people in effect have gotten the heck out of the way. So we're hearing a lot about fire, and for really good reasons. The area burned is increasing throughout the Western United States. This is projected to continue. It's unclear whether the severity, one way to think of severity is how much vegetation is killed in a fire. Unclear whether that's going to happen, but fires are becoming more frequent and the area burned is becoming larger. That obviously has really profound consequences for people. And I do not mean to in any way, shape, or form trivialize the loss of life, the loss of structures, the displacement, everything else that happens to people. But it drives me a little bit bonkers when I hear fairly common language about things like the fire consumed X number of acres, or devastated or destroyed. That is true of people's lives. That is not necessarily true of ecosystems. And everything I say, someone could point to and say, well, there's an exception here, here, or here. That is true. Absolutely everything I say, there are going to be exceptions. But people are talking in respect to fire about fuels management, and it's an interesting lexicon because fuels are plants. And so, in a sense, we're talking about removing plants, and often for the sake of trying to improve systems for people, which is one of the trade-offs that society has the prerogative to do. But it's a pretty tricky thing ecologically. And in part, one of the reasons that I think of that is, well, west of the Cascades, fuels management is unlikely to be very effective. West of the Cascades, fires require really extreme conditions to burn, and then it's very difficult for anything to stop them. And we've seen that in the past year. In some ecosystems, removal of plants can potentially reduce the extent of fire or make it easier to contain fire, but only with regular maintenance. And right now, society can choose to spend its dollars however society chooses to spend its dollars. right now, most fire management budgets do not have the types of resources that would be necessary to do that type of management on a regular basis. The other thing that I often think about is that, you know, one often hears about selective treatment or selective cutting, something like that. And this picture is a good reminder that trees don't levitate and vegetation doesn't levitate. And so the ability to go in and remove plants for the sake of, generally speaking, making fire less of a risk to humans, it requires a lot of ground disturbance. So it's in some ways it is not benign, and that's a trade-off, but I think it's something that people don't often envision. They maybe envision, you know, kind of surgically removing certain plants. That's not often how it works because it just can't, it's not feasible. And in much of the high deserts, there is this challenge, and it's elsewhere too, but especially up here, that some plants do really, really well in disturbed ground. And paradoxically, one of them is this plant cheatgrass. It's Bromus tectorum. It's a non-native invasive grass that does very, very well in disturbed ground, and it is highly flammable. So once cheatgrass comes into an area, and it's pretty much everywhere, it's just not dominant everywhere across the Intermountain West, it tends to create a feedback in which fire becomes more frequent and larger, and then cheatgrass does really well, and on it goes. And that's not optimistic, so why am I talking about it? What I want to talk about is basically when fire is a part of every ecosystem. Every ecosystem evolved with fire. It's just a question of how often and how severe. And so when I hear things like, you know, an area was devastated, this is what an area that burned pretty hot looks like, even after a dry winter. There's regrowth immediately. And so, you know, when one goes into these areas after fire, you see that cycle starting very, very quickly. And an area is not, in fact, devastated. It just looks a lot different. And so, you know, this is some areas some of you may have heard of the Rim Fire in California. That was, I think, one of the largest fires in California at the time it went up. I believe 2015, but you know, there was regrowth immediately, and that was a very dry winter. But you see, you know, all kinds of regrowth in these areas, all kinds of wildflowers, butterflies. And in a sense, there are a lot of components of ecosystems, especially in old growth areas, that I'm putting this in human terms, but basically they're just waiting for the fire to have their day. I mean, you don't see those carpets of wildflowers, and you don't see lots and lots of butterflies in an old growth forest. But, you know, after a fire, that's their time. And so they do their thing afterward, and you see this renewal process almost immediately. So, I mean, that's something that I picture when I hear about the devastation. And yes, again, it is devastation to humans, but ecologically, it's renewal in a lot of ways, especially if people don't take out the dead plants, which provide a lot of nutrients. And if you think about carbon storage it's a net zero if you just wait long enough and you don't remove all of the dead plants. So it just is ecologically, it can be positive for a lot of things. Marine systems are not my area of expertise, and a lot of nasty things are happening in marine systems. And generally speaking, I am not as hopeful about some of the changes in marine systems as a result of climate change that I am about how terrestrial systems might respond. So I want to acknowledge that there are some pretty profound changes going on in marine systems, especially with respect to decrease in ocean pH, or what's often called ocean acidification. And that affects shell formation. One often hears about shell formation in bivalves that people like to eat, or shell formation in crabs, which people like to eat. One doesn't often hear about it in really small organisms that have shells, which crabs and bivalves like to eat, but this is a pretty big deal throughout the ecosystem. I'm going to talk more about what might happen or what is happening in terrestrial systems. And in terrestrial systems, a lot of how organisms might respond or adapt depends in part on how quickly climate change is happening. So compared to the geologic record, current changes in climate are happening more quickly. So you'll hear people say, oh, these changes happened in the past. They did, they happened over longer periods of time and provided more of an opportunity for evolution. There's also the fact that, as I mentioned, land use has changed a lot. And so it is a lot easier if you are an organism to move in the middle of Nevada than it is to move in the middle of the LA basin. You're dealing with a different set of stressors. And it also depends on how much diversity is in animal and plant populations and species. And all of these things are correlated sometimes in complex ways. So organisms or populations or species that already are not doing very well, in part because of land use and all of the consequences of land use, they generally have less diversity along any axis that you choose to measure diversity, and therefore their adaptive capacity is reduced. So maintaining genetic diversity, maintaining behavioral diversity, all these things allow a lot of adaptive capacity. But here is where some of these things get kind of interesting, and where some of the gloom and doom maybe is a little bit overstated. And again, exceptions to everything I'm saying. So I'm talking in generalization. So there's a lot of reports out there. Scientists say it sometimes without a whole lot of evidence. Some journalists say it sometimes without a lot of evidence, that there are going to be these phenological mismatches. So phenology is just a fancy word for seasonal events in the life cycle of plants and animals. So when do birds return from their winter grounds? When are they getting frisky? When are they mating? When are trees flowering? And as climate is changing, there are a lot of changes in phenology. So we hear about birds coming to places earlier. We hear about and we see certain things blooming earlier or drying up later or anything like that. So there is a fair bit there are many suggestions out there that, that these types of changes in phenology are going to mess up species interactions. That organism X is going to show up in a place seasonally, and it's going to find that its food has already disappeared or something like that, that basically organisms are going to be out of sync because of these phenological changes, and that this is going to be a stinking disaster. The evidence that has been compiled to date is that those mismatches are rare. Not that changes in phenology are rare, those are happening a lot, but that those disrupted interactions are fairly rare to date. And that to date, they have mostly been documented in competitive interactions at high latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. So places where there's a really short growing season, breeding season, active season, and there's inherently not a whole lot of flexibility. That's mainly where it's been observed. So there is limited evidence to date that these types of phenological mismatches are going to create ecological havoc. I'm going to talk a little bit about butterflies because I know them and they're fun. So one often hears things like butterflies are sensitive indicators of, you name it, of climate change, of any type of environmental change. Butterflies are touted as sensitive indicators of every darn thing. They're not. So what they are is highly responsive to environmental change. And that extraordinary responsiveness to environmental change actually makes them really difficult as indicators or correlates of other types of long-term deterministic changes. So you think about if something is really highly variable from year to year, it's not necessarily the best indication of a long-term trend. So think of it as signal and noise. Butterflies are really noisy, which makes them difficult as long-term signals. One of the other things is that if ideally, so I mean, we all know the life cycle, right? You have an egg, and then you have a caterpillar, and then you have a pupa, and then you have an adult butterfly. But mostly for lots of good reasons, humans sample the adult form. We sample the adult butterfly, and that's the most generalist of the life stages. And so, if we were seeing high responsiveness, it likely would be at a stage that, or more likely would be at a stage that's really difficult to sample. So there are all kinds of confounding factors with sampling, but basically butterflies are these little weather vanes with wings, and they're actually fairly adaptive. This is kind of just a neat thing with timing. I don't want to get overly technical, but we talk about the flight periods of butterflies, for example. they don't all emerge at once. So birds tend to have a sort of well-defined breeding season, and it takes a really anomalous weather year to shift the timing of that breeding season in a lot of the West. Butterflies, again, little weather vanes with wings, or at least for a little part of the year, they're weather vanes with wings. They're weather vanes without wings the rest of the time. So what this is showing is the emergence of the adult stage. And if you want to drop a fancy word, it's called protandry, but basically it means that the males emerge before the females. Evolutionarily, this means that when the females come out as butterflies, they get mated very quickly. So this is an adaptation to maximize reproductive output. So you have the males coming out before the females, and you have both of them having really staggered emergence times. So all of this makes it pretty difficult to track responses of butterflies at the population level to environmental variability. Again, you have all these confounding factors. Butterflies do some really neat things, and they do some really neat adaptive things. So this butterfly is Euphydrius editha. It is somewhat famous in butterfly world. There have been a lot of studies on this organism. And I think, hopefully my cursor's showing up. So these are eggs this is a female. She is laying eggs on this plant. And it's kind of neat. The eggs start out as green, and then within a couple days they change to yellow, and then they change to purple, and then they change to gray. I have no idea why they do this. It's just really fun to watch. And then there are maybe 7 or so different larval stages. It's a pretty fascinating life cycle. But these animals do neat things. So there's a lot of things that you will hear are, butterflies are tightly coupled to one host plant. And if something happens to that host plant, the butterflies are hosed. And evolution largely has taken care of that by ensuring that single types of organisms rarely are totally dependent on one type of plant. So in this particular butterfly, there are lots of Euphydrius editha. In the Western Sierra Nevada, this butterfly largely feeds on 2 different types of plants. One of them, Collinsia, this blue guy, is available during a pretty short window of time, relatively early in the flight season. So think about that curve again with when different individuals were emerging. So you have females that show up early and females that show up late. So the early females get to lay their eggs on on Collinsia. And then there's this other plant that has a much longer duration of presence. So if the females that are out early or that are out late can lay their eggs on Pedicularis, this other plant. So that seems great, right? There's a pretty interesting thing going on here with adaptation. And so the Collinsia, they're much more abundant in a lot of places, but females can't always use them. And so, the ones that come out later are using this other plant. And there's a pretty interesting trade-off in terms of the animals that are out early. They develop really well. They generally have pretty high survival in those early life stages. The animals that are out later have to lay their eggs closer to the ground, and it gets quite hot at ground level later in summer. So there's this kind of trade-off in that if you're out late, you have plants available to you, but it's possible that your eggs basically they don't literally cook, but they're gonna desiccate. However, there is this flexibility in the system. And this is not uncommon. And so in effect, what this means is that if one plant is hit hard by some type of extreme weather event, for example, many of the organisms can lay their eggs on the other plant. And so this has been observed in a number of populations of this species, that basically there can be a switch. So what this is all getting to is there's a lot of flexibility in these populations and in these species that allows them to deal with environmental variation over the short term, and to some extent environmental change over the long term. There are also some really neat things with butterfly flight. So the temperature, butterflies are ectotherms, loosely they're cold-blooded. And so they have to warm up to be able to fly. So at higher latitudes or at higher elevations, generally they require, they need to get warmer to be able to fly. And heat, you need heat to fly because the muscles have to warm up, the wing muscles have to warm up, but then heat is lost in flight. So the butterflies, these particular butterflies, actually take flight at higher temperatures in northern latitudes than at southern latitudes or at higher elevations. And this all relates to how much heat they lose during flight. So in all of these different latitudes and elevations, when the animals are basking, they're basically oriented to the sun in more or less the same way, and they're absorbing equal amounts of heat. But they lose more heat in the north. And so therefore they have to warm up more to be able to fly in the north. And so to me, this was a really interesting study when it came out, because there's a lot of discussion about basically, you know, organisms are following some type of temperature envelope. And so they have to move higher north and they have to move higher in elevation, or basically they're gonna fry. And it's more complicated than that. I mean, a lot of organisms have much more complicated environmental interactions and have evolved very interesting ways, even if they're organisms with no brain to speak of, have evolved really interesting ways to deal with changes in temperature, in solar radiation, and what have you. So lots and lots of flexibility in these organisms. And they have short generation times, which also allows for more adaptation. So many of us a couple of years ago, you know, heard additional, and this is not just climate, this is also land use, but we heard these headlines about, you know, all the birds are going away. So this was covered. There was a paper in Science, which is a really high profile journal, and this paper was covered extensively in basically every media outlet that said, you know, birds are all going away. And then there was pretty rapidly, there were some scientists that said, let's look at that a little more closely. And I think there was in this case, some really, really thoughtful feedback. I mean, this wasn't people trashing each other. It was people looking at the data and looking at the coverage and very thoughtfully saying, okay, let's look at this and let's look at the nuance in a bit more detail. And so in this case, there were a number of people that again, very constructively in my mind said, well, what's happening with the packaging of science? What are the incentives? I mean, this wasn't new news. This was a good example of this, to think about what is required to get various scientific work covered in the media. And, you know, many of us have the experience that because, sort of for good reasons, there is more awareness that just publishing in the scientific literature, which no one reads, that's not enough, especially in fields or at institutions that want to connect with the public. Okay, so how does one then measure what's often called impact in ways that go beyond the journals that no one reads? Well, you get into the media. You get media coverage, you get popular coverage, what have you. And paradoxically, that kind of creates an incentive sometimes to not be as careful about what one knows for sure and what one does not know. And a little bit sometimes of headline seeking, or, you know, of changes. People would like there are many people who would like others to change their behavior, to do things that they think are right. So in this case, there was discussion about sort of the packaging aspects of science and some of the incentives. There were also discussions about the data and what they mean. So the scientific caveats that were pointed out, and the authors of the All the Birds Are Going Away paper said, yes, we understand that maybe we stated things a little bit too categorically. Much of the loss was accounted for by non-native birds and by species with really large population sizes. So for example, think about European starlings. European starlings not doing well in some parts of the country. I mean, they're perfectly nice birds, but, you know, if one said, how worried are you about European starlings versus some species that are much more restricted in where they live, that are much more sort of inherently rare, we probably would say we're more concerned about the warbling vireos of the world than the European starlings. So that accounted for a lot of the loss. There's also some pretty interesting things in terms of sort of long-term land use change and areas that are recovering from land use change. So again, oversimplifying, think about the eastern United States. When that area was first colonized, a lot of forests and woodlands were cut, and they were used for agriculture. And so there's a shift, right? Some of the species birds that do very well in woodlands weren't doing so well. Birds that can capitalize on agricultural areas did great, that makes sense. Well, as some of the agricultural areas are becoming forested again, as some of those land uses are changing in the east, you're just getting a shift. You're getting a shift between the species that are doing well in woods and species that are doing well in grasslands and agricultural areas. So over the long term, there may be just some of these shifts that associate with land use. So, I mean, they might be desirable, they might be undesirable, but it's not as simple as, I think the message that was put out by some media outlets that were not particularly cautious, climate is changing and we're losing all the birds. Not really that simple. Similar thing with respect to insects. We're hearing about insect apocalypse. In this case, there is a little bit more nuance about, land use change being one of the major drivers, but, it depends. And so this is sort of a reason to just be cautious about the headlines about something apocalyptic happening. So people looked at long-term ecological research sites in which there's relatively little human footprint as compared to a lot of agricultural areas, and found that insect abundance and diversity really weren't changing all that much. So maybe this is an example of, if people just got the heck out of the way, which of course is not going to happen in a lot of places. But again, a little bit more nuance with respect to the insect apocalypse. So this is the last one that I'll pick on. This was really recent. An article came out about butterflies disappearing across the Western United States. I have some questions about the data and what was inferred, but basically, this came out fine. So there have been a lot of cases. The actual article made one comment in the introduction about insects and pollinators. It did not specifically say butterflies are pollinators, and because butterflies are declining according to those analyses, there's going to be no more pollination. But that was in some of the headlines that came out. So this was the Washington Post coverage. This was just about a little bit more than a week ago, coverage of this paper in Science. So the headline comes out, this has implications for crops and the environment. And there's a photograph here that was in the Washington Post story of monarch butterflies, which are not doing well. And so the article, not drawing from the Washington Post article, not drawing from the scientific paper, said basically butterflies, that loss of butterflies is a real big problem because, like bees, they play a key role in pollinating crops and wildflowers. That's not true. And so these statements about butterflies and especially monarchs being these major pollinators is just not supported by scientific evidence. There are, again, exceptions. There are some really cool cases where, for example, there are some orchids in South Africa that are exclusively butterfly pollinated. And in those cases, the butterflies pollinate the orchids with their wings. I mean, there are some really, really cool co-evolution examples in the world. But this overall categorical statement that butterflies are key pollinators is not supported by the scientific evidence. And so let me see, I'm trying to remember a couple. I went into the literature because this was driving me crazy. A couple of the figures that I was able to pull. So of the plants, the crops that are visited either by bees and other insects, or exclusively by non-insect bees, the ones that are visited exclusively by non-bee insects are less than 1% of the cash value of the crops that are visited by bees and other insects. With respect to monarch butterflies in particular, they're actually really lousy pollinators. And I found a great article from 2017 that was in the governance literature that looked at, well, how has this come up? If the scientific evidence is that monarchs are lousy pollinators, why do so many statements say, they're great, they're really important pollinators? And it basically said, this is political. That this has perpetuated because the policymakers or the NGOs or what have you that are making these statements, they get more power by continuing to make these claims. And this was not an advocacy article. This was, sort of analysis of human behavior and policy and the literature as they saw it. So again, I love butterflies. I would really like to see them persist. But if they disappear tomorrow, we're not in danger of losing all of our crops. Bees are a different story. Bees, we lose bees, we are well and truly hosed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, let's see, maybe I'll make this a little bit shorter. So there are a lot of claims out there. Some of the claims about, loss of habitat for lots and lots of organisms kind of oversimplify what organisms respond to. So oftentimes people will say, okay, here is the current range of a particular species. And that's often based on, general range maps, and often based on temperature, because temperature is much easier to model than a lot of other climate variables. So then one will kind of say, okay, within that range, what's sort of within the range of the organism, what's the breadth of temperatures, say annual average temperature. Averages are pretty common in these models. And then they'll say, okay, what are the locations where temperatures are predicted to be within that spread in the future? And then they'll say, okay, therefore, that's where the organisms are going to be in the future. And there are a lot of problems with that. So for example, organisms don't typically respond to averages. I'm guessing that most of us are not dressing for the mean March temperature and precipitation. We're dressing for whatever it's doing today. Organisms are the same way. They're not reacting to means. There also are these characterizations that are based on what sometimes is referred to as habitat. And this is one of the things that I get really riled about. Habitat is not synonymous with land cover or vegetation type. So when there are these projections of, let's say this forest, the Douglas fir forests are going to move here in the future, and lots of organisms that are associated with Douglas fir forests are going to move along with them. That is kind of a gross oversimplification. So habitat doesn't mean forest or grassland or anything like that. Habitat is different for every species, and it's basically all of the resources that a particular organism needs to survive and reproduce. Who cares? Why am I talking about this? Because if you think about management of, let's say, riparian areas, different species are going to respond to management of the willows or to the aspens or to the stream itself. There is not one management prescription or solution other than, keep the riparian areas in pretty good shape and keep people and large numbers of livestock out of them. There's not one solution. So manipulation or, kind of fine-tuned management prescriptions, they're not going to benefit everything. All organisms all see the world differently. And what this translates into sometimes, you don't need to worry about the details here, is that if you look at the responses in this case of abundance of birds to different climate variables, different species respond to different variables, even when they're in the same geographic area and even when they're in the same vegetation type. So some organisms respond really strongly to variability in precipitation. Some respond strongly to variability in temperature. And some of them respond to one season and some of them respond to a different season. So there's this tremendous amount of variability that is great because it allows for adaptation. That means that kind of trying to do these broad sweeping generalizations about what's going to happen to plants and animals as climate changes, it's just a lot more complicated than that. And while I recognize the desire for simplification and the desire to kind of say, okay, what do we know? What are some general messages? I think it matters because it de-emphasizes the fact that organisms often can adapt, again, especially if there's not a huge amount of human land use in the area. And there's a lot of adaptive capacity and a lot of variation. And to me, that is really, really hopeful. Another example of the same thing, I think I am going to leave it there because it's getting late and it would be fun to just talk about this.
I was looking forward to the other slides. It's like, whoop.
Well,
thanks, Erica. That was great.
Yeah.
To talk about all the various complications and those broad sweeping statements that journalists love to make. Okay, well, first I want to thank everybody to be here. And if you have any questions for Erica, please write them in the chat and I will read them. And if you want more details, I'll unmute you and you can talk with Erica. So my first question to get the discussion started is, you've heard it before because you've been on these videos. How important do you feel it is for lay people to know about your research?
I don't know. I mean, I've wrestled with that throughout my career. I think it's important for lay people to know how ecosystems work and to know about these types of adaptation and variability and what affects responses. I mean, it's kind of painful to say that a lot of the ecological research that I've done, it probably isn't that important for a lot of people to know about it. I think but to know about these places, to connect with ecosystems and species and just to understand what makes them tick and to understand how variable they are and how tough they are and how they've persisted through millennia. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I remember meeting you after one of Camille Parmesan's talk about, the extinction of all the butterflies. And it was really refreshing to hear your take on it, saying, well, wait a minute, we need more data and we look at where they went. Anyway, second question, how do you think the artists are going to go about communicating what you're telling them today? Do you think that's going to be useful? Are you going to be able to use it in future talks as illustration or?
Me? Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, but I mean, I love adding art and poetry and, cool things to talks. I mean, no one wants to look at images of statistical outputs and things like that. And I think it's another way to connect with people. And that's what we're doing. I mean, we're not giving presentations to hear ourselves talk. We're giving presentations to connect with people. And I mean, I'm a scientist. That's how I earn my living. But I find it much more interesting to read a National Geographic article than to read most scientific papers. I mean, they have pictures. They tell a good story. So if I assume that most people are like me, and most of us, usually assume most people are like me, it makes for a much better way to engage with your audience, no matter who it is, whether it's scientists or anyone, third graders.
What was the most surprising thing you've ever found in your research?
Oh, most surprising thing I've ever found. I have to think about that. I don't know if I'm going to come up with something right away. I guess sometimes I'm really surprised where organisms show up. So, I mean, there's theory that suggests that that a species can persist over the long term, even if its populations are pretty isolated, if occasionally one organism moves between populations. So if you think about, say, there's I don't know, any of us can think about this. You have isolated groups of a thing. But when you see them just isolated, it's really hard to sort of imagine that. And every now and again, I see an organism so far away from where I know its habitat is that, I mean, it's got to be doing some kind of long distance dispersal. And it just blows you away of sort of, okay, I guess this actually happens, but what the heck are you doing here? Or, I mean, you discover something like that, something that you just didn't expect to see there, or the things that evolutionarily are dead ends. So, I mean, you want to get a birder hot and bothered. The one lost bird that has no chance of reproducing whatsoever, but it's somewhere that it ought not be, and everyone, goes crazy. It's so neat to see that. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's always just like the unexpected. We're all really excited by the unexpected.
Jerry Bartholomew writes, I appreciate the acknowledgement of complexity and our need to simplify the message. In phenology research, has there been much work on mismatches that might benefit species? I'm particularly thinking of pathogens, as they may rely on more than one host to complete their life cycles.
That is a really interesting point. I don't know, because I don't do much on pathogens. More of what I've seen some really interesting, although very scary work on the extent to which changes in land use are, increasing the likelihood of what's sometimes called spillover, of basically pathogens hopping from one species to the next. And that's, obviously what has been hypothesized to cause Ebola and COVID and other diseases. I don't know about the pathogen mismatches, but I'm really curious now and want to look into that. That's a really good question. I mean, pathogens can evolve really quickly, as we all know. They have super short generation times, and there are a lot of them, but I don't know.
Okay, sounds like I should invite Jerry to give a talk about the positive aspects. So Bruce is asking you, wonderfully presented, Erica. How should artists think about climate change effects, positive or negative, on ecosystem services?
Ooh. I'm sort of speechless. I mean, ecosystem services are basically the benefits that humans get from ecosystems. And I guess I think of ecosystem services was developed as a concept to sell nature to people. And it, in some cases, has been successful, and in other cases it hasn't. And I say that as a statement of fact, not as an indictment. I mean, nature was discussed for a long time, and then in the mid 1980s, the term biodiversity or biological diversity was coined as a way to talk about just the diversity of life. And I think this is my view of how this evolved. Hey, Bob, hey, Jill, biodiversity isn't really working to convince people. What else can we do? I know we can tell people that they get lots of benefits from ecosystems for free. Let's talk about ecosystem services, and then maybe we'll convince people. And that didn't really work either. So I guess, I mean, I think of some of these services, the ones that capture me more, I guess, it's less pragmatic. I mean, ecosystem services was intended to be sort of a financial argument. But to me, it's incredible that that there are these cycles. So think about nutrient cycles, which are an ecosystem service in that sort of conceptual world. Carbon cycling after a fire, to me, I mean, it is amazing to go into an area that, yeah, right after the fire, it looks like crap. And then the next spring you go in, and I mean, there are flowers everywhere, and there are butterflies everywhere, and there are butterflies super far from where you thought they would be, and you don't know how they got there. And I mean, just that kind of renewal, things that happen that way, or, any of us going into seeing, I mean, it sounds stupid, but like seeing how much a stream fills up after a really heavy rainstorm, or, the first rainstorm of fall. So those kinds of things, they're just these natural phenomena that I don't know anyone with a heart that doesn't find that kind of magical. So I guess maybe that's how I would think about it is, I mean, some sort of complex interactions between climate change and some of those processes. How will those processes respond?
So Steve's asking, what should we take home from your presentation? That we need not to be worried about climate change because species, their habitats and ecosystems are robust in the face of disturbance? How do scientists portray the uncertainty of their work? We are lampooned for answering every question with, well, it depends.
Well, so I guess take homes are that climate change can be a threat or an opportunity, depends on the organism, because it does depend. It is more likely to be a threat in areas that already are quite heavily modified by human activities, because organisms have less capacity to adapt in those circumstances. So kind of amounts to, given a fighting chance, many organisms will do okay. that's as much of a take home as I can probably get. I mean, polar bears, right? They're the icon of climate change. When you talk to, and there's some really interesting things with the pictures of starving polar bears, where you realize that photographers went and sought out polar bears that were starving for those images. But I mean, when you talk to bear biologists, they say, you know, they're not going to do well as climate changes. They're probably going to interbreed with brown bears, but you know, they're not necessarily going to go extinct because they're a pretty adaptable species. And a lot of these bears, you know, over time are going to find some way to persist in some manner. So, you know, they may look quite different in the future, but we're not going to lose all of the polar bears. You know, and it's a hard thing to take. Of some things may not do well. They may kind of hobble along for a while, but I don't know.
On a big picture scale, you and others in the series seem to differentiate between climate change and land use induced impacts. Aren't they both ultimately related to human behaviors?
Yes. Yeah. But it's still, organisms, generally speaking, they have evolved with changes in climate. The changes may have been of different magnitude and they generally were not as rapid, but organisms deal with changes in climate. That's not, and I'm trying to think of how to say this. That's something that organisms more or less have evolutionarily dealt with, is changes in climate. Changes in human activity of the type that have happened over the past several hundred years, organisms have not, you know, dealt with over evolutionary time. And, you know, it's a different thing to be kind of moving around along an elevational gradient, or maybe, you know, among trees and grasslands or what have you, than to basically have that be gone. Or to have, you know, maybe there's less water in the stream because of climate change, but to have the water be taken out entirely for irrigation. And I'm not making light of what humans need to live well all over the world, and some of the real profound challenges we have with social equity and things like that. But I think it's, generally speaking, what have organisms evolved with, and they've evolved with forms of climate change. They have not evolved with the magnitude of changes in land use that they deal with today.
Where does the renewal come from if you're not expecting it?
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
I think, well, Hester can say, you can unmute herself and say that, but you were talking about renewal after a fire, how surprising it was. I know you were not that surprised, but Hester, go for it.
Well, yeah, and I've always wondered that in other contexts too. How do they know to go there? You were mentioning organisms that you said, what the heck are you doing here?
Yeah.
So how do they know to go to this, to this burnt out wood, if they hadn't been there before?
So that's a really, okay, I'm about to speculate a little bit. They may not be dying in the fire to the extent that they've been thought to die in the fire. So for butterflies, for example, there are non-adult butterfly life stages in the soil and the plants that have been thought to die when it's quite hot from the fire, but maybe they don't. There's some speculation that when there are these extraordinary plumes that are, this is not my area of expertise, but basically you get these plumes of smoke that are lofted by winds and travel long distances, that there may be some dispersal by the winds. I mean, that's been shown in some cases for like fungal spores, things like that. So possibly there's some transport of other organisms. There's also the possibility that in some cases humans are underestimating the dispersal capacity of organisms. Which, you know, I think to some extent is true. You do get those periodic long-range dispersals that are surprising but plausible. So I think it's a number of different things where basically nature is much more complicated than we understand. So it's not necessarily just things kind of making a decision to go there, but we don't understand some of these, what's happening in some ways.
And one last question, what are the what might be your reason for optimism looking forward?
Nature's tough. And I mean, I'm not super optimistic about people and people's ability to persist, but I think that there are a lot of plants and animals that are going to be here long after us. So I mean, and I like people. I don't want people to go away, but nature's pretty tough. I mean, I look at something like Chernobyl, and there's been so much recovery after Chernobyl in places where I think humans wrote it off as this is just going to be dead in a wasteland for time immemorial. Actually, there's a lot in there. I mean, I don't want to eat anything from there, but a lot of organisms are doing quite well.
Yeah, same after Mount St. Helens. It was the same. It's like, oh, it's never going to be. Or after the fires in Yellowstone, nothing's going to survive. It's like, they do survive.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Erica, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here today. And there is no talk on Friday as far as I know, but there will be 2 next week, one on Monday and one on Thursday. And I hope to see you there. There's going to be a talk about wine and wine growing in Oregon, and that's definitely good news, and with climate change. And then Lizzie is going to talk about coral reefs, and she works for TNC, and so she'll tell us that some of the corals are definitely surviving, and especially those that we didn't know existed deeper in the ocean. Anyway, so thank you very much, and hope to see you next week. And again, Erica, thank you so much for a great talk and discussion. Much appreciated. That was great. It was lessons for a scientist as much as to the artists. Which no, it's great. I appreciate it. That's really cool.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what all of you artists come up with from this. I mean, it's going to be just terrific.
Yeah, especially with that many artists who have signed up. I hope they are very prolific, and we see a lot of pieces of art. We've asked a maximum of 3 per person, so there are now 80 artists who have signed up, so that's a lot of pieces to look through.
Yeah,
it should be really fun. So and we'll do it I mean, there's going to be obviously triage, and the art center is not that big, but we'll have quite a few there. And there'll be also something online, so we'll try to photograph everything. And I'm going to talk to Chris Nichols, for the Center for whatever it's called, Humanities, and hopefully he can do something about it and have it in his center to have a sub show. And then Jerry will help me with the art sci group on campus, and maybe we can get Lascelles for a show for a month. So that would be cool.
Yeah.
Yep. But someday I need to go with you to the Valley of the Giants, because that's you'll love to see those trees.
Yeah, I really, well, obviously you saw that, you probably, one of those pictures was familiar. I just kind of blew me away.
Yeah.
All right. Steve, I'm laughing at your message about, fire adapted forests. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yes, right. Yeah, Steve's dealing with that. Yeah, we should walk together. He'll tell you stories.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Dominique, and everyone. It's nice to meet you. I look forward to being able to do it in person.
Yes, definitely. That would be nice. Okay, well, have a great afternoon, Erica.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.